So we are now recording. Welcome everybody. This is Heather Riggs with the New England Museum Association. If you guys want to type in the chat feature where who you are and where you're coming from, that would be great so you guys could see each other, although we do see your lovely faces. That would be great. Today's session is being recorded and will be available on the NEMO website later, or actually I will be emailing it to you since this is a workshop. So that link will be sent afterwards. So I want to get us going. So there's a lot of content today to cover, and it's a great session on letting go of your house museum. So I'm going to turn it over to Valerie Talmadge. She's the Executive Director at Preserve Rhode Island.
Thanks, Heather. Hi, everybody. Thanks for attending. I thought I'd set up a little context and then tell you how we're going to proceed today, but let me just sort of set the stage before we get into the practicalities. And I recognize many of you have been kicking around New England and land conservation and historic preservation for a long time, so it's nice to see some friendly faces out there. So historic preservation has a long relationship with house museums. So the rescuing of an historic building that's been endangered often ends in the setting up of a museum. And this is in the very first parts of the urge to protect historic properties in America, so that we know that that first preservation effort was at Mount Vernon, and it ended in a house museum that still operates today. So somehow the efforts and instincts to preserve an historic place have often sort of matched in people's minds, oh, we must be setting up a house museum. It's sort of like peanut butter and jelly, historic preservation and house museums. But it turns out that the efforts that are needed to successfully preserve a property and to run a successful museum are two entirely different things and require different skill sets, different visions, different funding. And so it's not often the right match. And just because an organization can muster the political or the financial or the real estate prowess to save a place, or in many cases in New England, a property owner has a vision for saving their place and thinks that it must be a house museum, it doesn't mean that the museum itself is going to be a successful business. So museums are hard, and house museums are really hard. When you're caring for an historic place, you're looking not only at the building care, but at collections care, but also the museum part of it is interacting with people. So it's putting on programs and imaginative and exciting exhibits that draw people to come to your place. But you can have the most amazing exhibit and want to impart the most interesting pieces of historical information. But if you don't have the marketing and advertising to get people to come, you're putting, it's like if a tree falls in the forest, is anyone here? If you put on a program and nobody comes, was it successful? Our house museums across New England are underfunded and sometimes unfunded. And as we all know, those historic buildings are money pits. This is not a good trajectory where you have declining resources and increasing needs. And that the budgets beyond physical care to develop those programs are constrained and hardly ever lead us to actually promoting our work in a way that is attractive to the public. And then there's the whole issue of visitation. So am I old enough to say, what's the matter with kids today? They don't come to our places. And this is part of our world, is how do you get people up off the couch and into visiting the programs and places that we think that they should do. And there are very few operations around New England that are making it on the gate. That's the ticket sales. The ticket sales are such a modest component of most museums that it's just not a reasonable business model. And so if you step back a minute and think about the business model of museums, you have to think, what were we thinking? And just take Rhode Island. Rhode Island has 39 cities and towns. We have more than 100 sites, historic places, open to the public. So 100 places, 39 cities and towns. Those 100 places are owned by more than 80 different organizations. So who would ever invent a business model to take 100 of the state's most important historic resources and divide them into 80 different places, each of which has less capacity than the last in order to be successful? This is sort of like not sensible if we think about really trying to promote our state's history and save our precious places. When organizations, and there are some very large organizations, the largest preservation organization in New England is the Preservation Society of Newport County, which manages the mansions. And so that's one of the 80 organizations. But not many of us can aspire to that kind of visitation where you get 1 million visitors to the breakers. It's just not, it's not the world that most of us live in. So when you're a small organization, it's really hard to gain any efficiencies of scale. You end up having a lot of one-off programs that take really inordinate amount of effort, and then they can't be shared otherwise, and it sort of peters out that way. So if that wasn't a sort of challenging enough picture, now we have a pandemic on us, and our museums have been closed. And we're all considering ways that we can safely reopen these historic places. So can we disinfect and not harm historic surfaces? Can we be socially distant? We have a museum in Providence, our own museum, that if we go by the state's rules of social distancing, I think the maximum capacity is somewhere around 10 right now. So that's already a small institution is now further constrained by how many people we can really welcome into it. And will donors continue to support us, and will visitors come? So if these issues are things that sound familiar to you and you're struggling with your historic site, Barbara and I hope that this will seed some ideas for your future and discussion, and we can go forward. So let me tell you how we're going to proceed today. First, I'm really sad to let you know that Mary Anthony of the 1772 Foundation has a bereavement and is unable to join us today. And we are really going to miss her because she is a wonderful fountain of information about the conversion of historic house museums across the country. So she was supposed to give us the optimistic alternatives. So that is just a note to Heather. We'll have to do a reprise when Mary is able to join us again to do it, because we really regret that she can't be here. So what we are going to do is we're going to start with a case study from Pawtucket, Rhode Island, and Barbara Zadrowski from the Preservation Society Pawtucket is going to talk about the Joseph Spaulding House and their multi-year process that set that historic property on a new pathway while preserving the structure. And then I'm going to take up some of the practicalities about how to move your organization from where you are today to where you might like to be for your cherished place. And finally, we're going to have a good long time for discussions. Heather, as she mentioned, is poised to manage the chat feature, but there are few enough people that I think we'll also just have a free-for-all at the end for questions to go forward. So that's the scheme, and we're going to start with Barbara. So thank you, Barbara.
Right. Thank you. Oh, sorry, I'm hearing feedback from myself. Good morning, everybody, and I'm really, it's very interesting to see the scope of institutions that are joining us this morning, and I really hope this will be useful. For us to have gone through this experience, it would really, I think, mean even more to us if it actually helps somebody else who was in is in the position that we were in. So I'm Barbara Drevesky. I'm have been the board president of the Preservation Society in Pawtucket, Rhode Island since early 2016. And this morning, I'm just gonna sort of outline the process that we undertook to come to the decision to sell a house that we owned and how we went about doing it. And you have some documents that will give you also some context. And so you'll hear me mention some of those documents along the way. The Joseph Spaulding House and its contents were gifted to the Preservation Society of Pawtucket in 2012 with the intent to maintain the house as an example of 19th century architecture and decorative art. So the house was packed full of antiques and decorative arts that had been owned by the woman who lived there. The Preservation Society, over the years after receiving the house, pursued many ways to showcase the house, to get interest in it. But we, as a very small organization, did not have the resources to operate it as a house museum, and nor could we guarantee its long-term preservation. So in the end, we made the decision to disperse the contents and sell the house with a preservation easement attached. And that was really the most viable option for us. The Preservation Society itself was founded about 40 years ago, just exactly 40 years ago, with a specific mission to preserve historic buildings in Pawtucket. And now we are run by a group of 12 volunteers, so we're entirely a volunteer organization. And right now, most of our activities are in the form of education programs like tours and lectures. We also do advocacy efforts as much as we can. So getting back to 2012, the society was deeded this 1828 house and its contents. The house had belonged to a woman named Betty Johnson, and she was a much loved history researcher, and she also happened to be a founding member of the Preservation Society. She had actually created her own organization called the Pawtucket History Research Center. And it was her desire that her house and the stuff in it and her history collection would be preserved in perpetuity, funded by an endowment. She wanted this to be a museum and a research center for the community. But she got old, she went into a nursing home, and her estate ultimately could not finance her goals, and she died in 2010. And then 2 years after that, her organization, which I'm going to call the PHRC just to make it simpler, they by 2012 were failing because they had no income. So they drafted a deed of gift that transferred the house and the contents to the Preservation Society, and they established a very small endowment to, well, their intention was for it to sustain the house, but it hasn't, it draws about $1,500 a year in interest. And so, as you know, $1,500 is nowhere near enough to sustain an 1828 house for an entire year. Her research materials, though, so we got the house and the furniture and the contents, but her research collection was gifted to the Pawtucket Library. And so there it is, and that remains intact, and it's a useful research resource that is kept at the library. So the society experimented with a lot of different ways to maintain the house. We had garden parties. The house is on a double lot, has a beautiful yard. There were at one time a lot of fruit trees, and so it was a lovely site for garden parties. We had open houses, we had on-site lectures by master gardeners. We even spent many thousands of dollars to design an online virtual tour. But unfortunately, none of these generated any income and certainly not enough interest to support the house. So very soon it was draining all of our finances and our personnel resources. Taking care of this house was really consuming everything that we had. And even worse, our actual mission just kind of fell by the wayside. We didn't have the energy or the ability to attend to our mission statement. As a last-ditch effort, we ran the house as an Airbnb rental for about 2 years. And we did earn enough to break even and pay the utility bills. But our board members that kind of turned our board members into hotel staff. And so we were spending more time doing laundry and changing sheets and, you know, cutting the lawn than we were actually doing any preservation work. And we also were risking theft and damage to the house and its contents. And as I said, our mission was still being ignored. So this was not a long-term solution either. Our board meetings were consumed with talking about the budget. There were many, there were dissenting views on what to do and how to handle the house. There were arguments. Morale really had bottomed out and frustration was bubbling over. People were getting irate and walking out of board meetings, and so it was a bad scene. Early in 2016, there were changes in our board personnel, and that thankfully cleared the way for us to come to a unanimous decision to move forward with selling the house. I've shared with you the deed of gift, and so if you've looked through it, you'll see that it's an extremely complicated document, and before we could sell the house, we really had to unravel that document. And we had to hire a lawyer just to be able to understand what the deed was saying before we could even try to tackle all of the rules and requirements that were in it. So the first thing we had to do before we could even contemplate selling the house is we had to approach statewide historical and preservation institutions to ask if they would want to assume ownership of the house. We could just give it to them if they wanted it, and of course none accepted. So then we started to move forward with the process of selling it. The first thing we had to do, though, was consider how to attach a preservation easement. This is something that we knew we would do anyway, but the deed actually required that we first approach Historic New England, and then the second option was Preserve Rhode Island. So we got through those discussions and ultimately decided to work with Preserve Rhode Island, which is why Valerie is part of this conversation. And working with her, we drafted an easement description and a template, and then we hired a realtor to list the house. Choosing the right realtor was really a key factor. We needed one, obviously, with experience in marketing and selling historic houses, and one who understood the purpose of an easement and one who was going to be open to that process. And we really got lucky with the realtor that we had. She was in it for the long haul and was with us every step of the way. The house was not regularly open to the public. It was visited by so few people. It's in a very low traffic neighborhood. We didn't think that the general public even knew that this house existed. And so we didn't think anybody would consider it to be a house museum. So our thoughts were, well, we could just sell this house and it's our decision and nobody will really care. Valerie, however, knew better, and so she advised us to prepare a PR plan and also a document that where we wrote out the answers to anticipated questions or criticisms that might come from the community once they started to learn that we were going to sell the house. We also made a plan to disperse the house and contents. So the contents really consisted of Betty's family furniture and decorative arts. She lived there her entire life. The house was owned by her aunt and her grandmother before she was even born, and she lived there her entire life through her married life. And so these were family items that had been collected over many decades, none or very few of which were actually related to the location. So we invited the Rhode Island Historical Society to come to the house and take a look and see if there was anything that they would want to add to their collection. And they did. They didn't take much, but they took a few things, and we wanted to make sure that whatever they believed was, anything that was really related to any aspect of Rhode Island history, we wanted to make sure stayed here in Rhode Island. We next hired an auction house to come to the house and look around at the many things and decide what they wanted or what they thought they could sell. And so they packed up, they filled 3 trucks of with stuff and took it down to the auction house, and they really handled everything for us, and that was an absolute godsend because we then had all the contents taken care of. But there were things left over that the auction house didn't take, like books and dishes and tools and things. So what we did is we invited neighbors and community members to come and just take anything that they wanted, and whatever was left over, we donated to local places like some bookstores and the Salvation Army. And then we were left with junk in the house, mattresses and file cabinets. And so we called a junk hauler and took that, had them take that away. So all along this process, we were extremely careful about documenting our decisions and our actions, particularly as they related to that were outlined in the deed of gift. We just wanted to make sure that we had documentation if anybody questioned our actions, that it was all going to be there, that we had unanimous support from the board, and that I or the treasurer were not operating in our own behalf. When the news of the decision was printed in the local papers, there were some negative reactions. And to put it in context, this was also at a time when the local baseball team had just announced they were leaving the city. A local hospital had just announced they were closing, and a very large manufacturer in the city had announced that they might be moving their headquarters somewhere else. So there were reactions from the community that, such as, well, everything is leaving and now this house. So we had to sort of reaffirm them that the house was not actually leaving, and the reason we were selling it is to make sure that it stayed. And so we had to answer some questions from the community. We also were contacted by the Attorney General's office because it's their duty to make sure that organizations or individuals are following donor intent. So they called us when they learned about the sale to make sure that we were honoring Betty's intent. And I feel like I have to mention here, for whatever it's worth, that it actually was not Betty's intent that we get her house. like I said, she had created her own organization, and in her will, she specifically stated the house should not be transferred to the Preservation Society. But how did we end up with it? Because that was, her will was changed in probate. And so, so that pretty much satisfied the Attorney General. It was not us that had to be responsible to them. We also were called to the mayor's office. There were a few people in the community that called up the mayor's office and said they didn't like what was happening. And so the mayor summoned us, and Valerie came with me, and to meet with specifically the planning department. And not necessarily that the mayor was questioning what we were doing, it's just that he wanted more information. The planning department just, you know, they just wanted to know what was happening. And so it actually turned out to be a good meeting. There were one or two people who, you know, were still criticizing and shared their concerns, but in the end, everybody seemed satisfied. Once they understood what the easement was for and what it was going to do, then it really all, you know, was okay. So in the meantime, the house went on the market. The realtor had an open house, and at the very first open house, we had about 40 people show up, which to us was fantastic. And within a couple of days, we had 3 offers made on the house. One of them actually slightly higher than our asking price. Each of the offers was accompanied by a letter that the people had written. Our choice of buyer, we chose the buyer really based on the tone of the letters. We didn't really know that these letters were going to come, but it really made the difference. The letter that was written by the buyers that we chose, it really communicated to us that they were devoted to preserving this house, and that they were very accepting of the easement process. And so, so we let them know, we let them know and move forward with them. I'm gonna get a sip of water. All right, so we started to move forward with the sale, but of course there were still gonna be some, a few more steps and some unanticipated hurdles. We were required by the deed to divide the proceeds of the sale of the house and the contents with the Pawtucket Library. And so we had to set up an endowment to make that happen. We had to work with the library, and we did that. We had to make some repairs to the house, nothing hugely major, but interior painting. We had to fix some broken glass and add smoke detectors. And this was all so that the house could pass a building inspection. We also had to pay Preserve Rhode Island for the easement process. And it was our hope that we could do this by transferring to them the endowment that was attached to the house. Because then it would just be theirs, and that would pay for the endowment or for the easement in perpetuity. But the Rhode Island Foundation, where the endowment is, in the end, we could not do this. And so I'm going to mention this a little bit later, but so we had to figure out how we were going to pay for the easement. So we worked with Valerie to do that. One massive hurdle, though, in the 11th hour, about 2 weeks before the closing was scheduled, we found out that the mortgage insurance company for the buyer was not going to insure the title of the house. And this is because if you look at the deed, you're going to see a bunch of rules and restrictions attached to the house. One of them is that the house had to be open to the public 5 times a year, I think it is. And so the mortgage insurance company, well, it was our understanding that once the house was sold, the deed and all of its requirements and restrictions would be nullified. But the mortgage insurance company actually said that no, it was the case that those restrictions and requirements would carry forward to the next buyer. And they were not going to insure a title that required a private home to be open to the public so many times a year. So what we had to do is track down the former members of the PHRC, Betty's organization that gave us the house, and we had to ask them to sign an affidavit that would essentially lift the restrictions. And we, did not know if they would do it. We didn't even know if we could find them. And this delayed the closing by another 3 months. And in the meantime, the buyers, they had already given up their apartment. So they asked if they could rent the house for the time being, and we were happy to do that. We were just really worried they were going to give up and walk away from the process. But they did not. They had to seek another lender. So they went through the process and did that. The PHRC members did in the end sign the affidavit. So as we were holding our breath for about 3 months, it all worked out in the end. And then the house was sold. We closed in April of 2019, a little over a year ago. And it was about 1.5 years, this process from beginning to end. Now I'm extremely happy to say the house is occupied. It's being properly maintained by owners that adore it and love the house, and it's not sitting vacant anymore, so it contributes to the life of the neighborhood. And PRI is the easement holder, and they've established a good relationship with the current owners. So now the state of the PSP is completely different. We were in crisis just a little over a year ago, and now we're at the point where we can devote 100% of our resources to our mission, to programs and activities. Just even last year, to our astonishment, a local newspaper listed our efforts in 2019 as one of the city's top 10 news stories, and that was amazing to us. We've added new board members and expanded our programming. And I think the most exciting thing we've done in the last year or so, besides selling the house, is we were able, so that endowment that had been attached to the house became operating income for us. And so because it was attached to the house and we no longer had the house, we didn't want to just say, oh yes, that's exciting, we're going to keep this income. We decided to create what we call a preservation reward program. So we're taking the income from that endowment and we're giving monetary rewards to completed preservation projects in the city of Pawtucket. And so just last month, we were able to announce the first winners of that program. And so that is hugely exciting for us. And in closing, I'm just gonna say, we were extremely lucky. I was extremely lucky, one, to have a treasurer that was phenomenal and really did so much of the legwork and the groundwork in this process, and also to have a board that was unanimously supportive every step of the way. It was a long and difficult process, but it was absolutely necessary if the organization was going to survive. So that's the end of my outline. So I'm going to turn it back over to Valerie, right? And Valerie has a few more things to talk about, and then we'll open it up for discussion.
Great. Barbara, that was a wonderful summary, and you didn't even talk about all the tears along the way.
Oh yeah, yeah.
It was really wonderful. So I think the theme of my comments, which is really the sort of practical aspects of working on getting your historic place into a new place, sustainable pathway, is that when you think about making decisions for an organization, it's very different than making decisions for your personal property. So many of us have bought and sold real estate, and some of us have settled relatives' estates and distributed contents and dealt with all those kinds of issues. And those experiences are really useful to anybody who's engaged in this, but they are not exactly parallel to how an organization can navigate its world. So what I'm going to touch on is some of the differences that an organization considers when it's thinking about the future of changing the conditions of and the future of its historic places. I have, I think, 6 different things to talk about, and I want to emphasize that none of this is sequential. And in fact, I think from Barbara's story, it's not very linear. You take a step forward, you have to go sideways, you're going around the way, you're always going back and forth on this. So don't think that step 1 is to do this and step 2 is to do this. You're always having to navigate these issues. But with that being said, I have 6 points and I've numbered them 1 to 6. So you can take them as steps if you want. So the first is to deal with the board and to gain board consensus. So when I say a board, I'm thinking of decisions by the governing board. And if you're a nonprofit, that's your board of trustees or your board of directors. But sometimes these properties are actually owned by municipalities, and then it's the town selectmen or the town council, which have their own decision-making process that has to be really considered. But whether it's a public entity or a nonprofit entity, these kinds of discussions can be sticky and difficult and fraught. And I have seen many a project founder at the very first question being raised at the board that it is such a contentious issue for board members to deal with that people don't know how to navigate these difficult issues with a board of directors. And I think this is especially true with low capacity organizations where the boards may not be as highly skilled in board work as in some of the organizations that have more capacity. Even the recognition that there is an issue can be uneven. You know, denial is a river in Egypt, and there's a lot of denial on the part of many people that you don't want to face the issues. And really, you can't solve a problem if you're not willing to face it. And while you might personally be willing to face it, if your board doesn't get its arms around what the issues are in a productive way, it can really be a showstopper. And I have observed in many of the small organizations in Rhode Island an unevenness in the amount of work that some of the board members are putting into the property versus the opinions that others who are not working so hard may have about what the future is. And so, you see people who are pouring their heart and soul and really realize that this is not sustainable, and others who are more likely to pontificate at meetings than to really roll up their sleeves. So those kinds of human dynamics are very common. So usually the decision is forced on an organization because of a financial catastrophe. You're on the brink of financial catastrophe. We only have $42 in the bank. How are we going to pay the heating bill? You know, that kind of, I mean, literally that level. But even that may not be enough for people who just who just so believe that their place must be a museum. It's the only future they can imagine. It's just a very, very contentious discussion. So what can help you get through some of these board dynamics? I would say to focus on process versus outcomes. You have to give space for people to talk. You have to give space for people to really imagine different futures without saying, well, we have to sell the property, or to move right into what an outcome would be. Really have to provide that kind of space. And you have to drive it. You can't just assume it's going to evolve. It's going to be an agenda item that's relentless on your discussion, but it's got to be. You have to anticipate that not everybody is going to come on board at the same way. The other thing you might consider are third-party validators. So people unassociated with your organization that might come and talk about the realities of the world may be very helpful in getting a stuck board into a different place. And there are many people in our field who are happy to validate how hard house museums are, how it's not your fault, and how expensive it is to own an historic property and to move in that direction. And then a real key to dispute resolution, if there is really a dispute, is, and this is in any field, not just in this particular issue, but it's through an analysis of alternatives. So it takes the personality out. If we say, okay, well, what are the alternatives? One alternative is certainly status quo. An alternative is not to make a decision, which is a decision. And an alternative is to imagine what different futures could be. And so a thorough evaluation of alternatives is often a key to any kind of dispute resolution. I have two references if your board is really struggling with this. The first is just the seminal work called Getting to Yes, which is good advice on negotiation. And if you find yourself in a struggle with other board members, this is a book, it's going to be 20 years old now, by Roger Fry and William Ury, called Getting to Yes. And it's just a wonderful way to move from dispute to solutions. And the other book you might do is a little pamphlet from Board Source called Taming the Troublesome Board Member. Because boards often have troublesome members, and there's at least some advice about how to work with those issues. So that's my first thing, is that, like, your board, if your board is fractured and not on the same page, it's impossible to make progress. That's really something that you need to do. And this is something that you need to work through. It doesn't mean that the board has to be in consensus before you take any other steps, because information from other steps may help build a consensus around a future by the board. But it does mean that you can't really make decisions until the board is agreeable in that area. So my second major kind of issue to deal with is a stakeholder analysis. Lots of people have lots of opinions. And many people hold lots of opinions unconstrained by facts. And many people hold opinions even if they haven't been to your site for years or never been there. They will have opinions about you. You just can't underestimate what people think. Many people think historic house museums just sort of magically are there, and that they don't really understand the financial realities of owning the property. It doesn't even occur to them that that's a business or that there are financial issues. It's out of there. It's a place that's always been there. It should always be there. And they don't really understand our world. And many people don't like change. And change is very threatening to them. That a change in status of that property can be quite difficult to people in the neighborhood, to people in the city, to everyone. When you're considering the change of the property status, if you do some consultation throughout the process with stakeholders, you will save yourself a lot of heartache, because then you're making a decision that's more known and accepted. And this is not a one and done. It's not like, let me make a list of my stakeholders. I will go talk to them and tell them what we're considering, check it off, and then we're done. It's continuing to go back to people as you're looking at them. In fact, in the early days, it might be the easiest time to do a stakeholder review, because you can be asking for advice. Once you make decisions and have to tell people what your decision is, then you may be in a different state with stakeholders. and who do I mean by stakeholders? Well, every site has your unique set of people that are going to come into their constellation of networks, but it's probably going to include the public officials in the town. It's probably going to include past board members. It may include members, probably will include volunteers to your organization. You may have users of your sites that are different than museum users. You may have renters or people who use your meeting space. The neighbors clearly have a sense. Donors have a lot of issues at stake. And other stakeholders can be sort of allies, like your statewide preservation organization. There's an organization like Preserve Rhode Island in each of the New England states. Your state historic preservation office, NEMA, I think is an issue. And then my last category of stakeholders, and I think everyone here will know somebody who fits this category. I call them butt-inskis. You just know they're gonna butt in. so how you're dealing with them is important. Okay, my third thing that you need to think about is the vision for the new use of the property. And sometimes it's really obvious. I think this is one issue that at the Spaulding House, Pawtucket didn't have to really consider much because it had been so recently used as a house. It was perfectly habitable and it makes a wonderful dwelling. And so it was obvious that it would be reused as a single family house. That was the easiest and best reuse of the property. But sometimes it is not so obvious about what the reuse plan should be. And sometimes buildings need a lot of work. So we are right now working on a late 17th century building in the town of Lincoln, which has been in a quasi house museum use for 30 years. And the building is not habitable. And there's nothing between a new use in that property that $400,000 won't fix. But finding that $400,000 is the challenge of the reuse there. This can immediately get into all the maintenance that's been deferred because your organization lacks resources. The fact that the museum use doesn't necessarily need the kind of plumbing and kitchens that you do if you're doing a residential use. It's what are the zoning rules? What is the neighborhood like? All these kinds of issues. So in the world of historic preservation, when you have an old building and are trying to imagine a new use for it, the action that a group takes is to do a feasibility assessment. And so here's another reference for you. It's a pamphlet published by the National Trust in 2015 called the Feasibility Assessment Manual for Reusing Historic Buildings. It's by Donovan Ribkema. It details the kinds of information you need to collect about your property and how you go about identifying alternative uses and then putting some financial numbers to those alternative uses so that you see whether or not they're feasible. So I think a feasibility assessment is really a fabulous alternative for you to think about. You could try to do this in-house, but it's often going to be easier if you have professionals doing this kind of work who can really understand the architectural constraints and the building constraints. If you know architects, preservation architects in your communities that would be willing to help do this kind of feasibility assessment, they would then also connect with historic property redevelopers and put some real numbers to the property. It's very site specific whether or not you need to go into this kind of fully fledged analysis. But even if you don't do the deep analysis of feasibility, having access to experts from architects to contractors to developers to realtors would really help you imagine a new future for the property. My fourth issue is the role of the easement. So preservation easements probably deserve a whole panel in and of themselves. There's a lot of issues with them. So I'm just going to give you the 5 easy minutes on easements. They are a tool that in both the preservation and conservation worlds overcome the legal prohibitions on perpetuity. So in the legal sense, the law abhors perpetuity, except for preservation and conservation easements, where it has allowed you to go ahead and do that. Easements are a wonderfully flexible tool while they're being created. They can protect interior features or exterior features. They can look at the site as well as the building. And they there's not a cookie cutter for the easements. They're negotiated for each property that fits the property owners and fits the property itself. And then once they're recorded, they're on the deed forever. They're permanent. They're like cast in stone. And what the easement does is set up a term for the easement holder to monitor changes to the building. So they prohibit demolition and they control future changes to the building as the easement prescribes. And they can provide a lot of peace of mind because instead of just selling the property to somebody who promises to do good, you know that there's a legal document that's there to make sure that in fact they don't damage the historic property. The easements are on title and are binding on the owner that acquires the property and all successors in title. And because the easement holder is taking on a permanent responsibility to the property, that responsibility needs to be funded because you have to make sure that somebody is there to go out and do the annual monitoring, to visit when there is an issue, and then also to have the funds to do legal enforcement if something goes awry. So the choice of your easement holders vary from state to state, but all New England states have some options that you can consider for partners to work on easements, and it is often a key role in the disposition from an organization to private holding. So the fifth thing I'm talking about is the disposition process itself. And as Barbara described, it's really a different process than selling your house. Your board has an obligation to meet its public interest and mission, and if the disposition of the property it meets your mission, that you have to keep that in mind. I always love the phrase, board members have an unwavering duty of loyalty to the organization. So that unwavering duty of loyalty to the organization means that you have to avoid conflict of interests. You have to really keep the organization's good in the front and center of your decision making. There are often legal requirements and restrictions on sale. As Barbara described, many of the house museums have provisions in their deeds that say if you organization X, who now own this property, ever decide you don't want to own it in the future, you must first offer it to this agency, that organization. You must go through some sort of a process, and that those legal requirements need to be understood and reviewed. The Attorney Generals in every state has an oversight of nonprofits, and this happens in two ways. First off, the Attorney General stands for donors of bequests. So who else is going to make sure that a nonprofit who receives a bequest is actually honoring the intent of that owner, so that they have the AG has a special responsibility with regard to bequests. And then there's also an oversight of organizations, of nonprofit organizations as they go out of business. So if your house museum is your only mission, if you really are thinking that not only do we want to dispose of the property, but there's no reason for us to continue, so we are going to just be dissolved, then that whole process of dissolution needs to be managed with the Attorney General, because the assets of the organization, the 42 cents that you have in the bank, must be properly housed. It's not a private benefit. There's a public benefit there. So really understanding where you are in terms of the organization, in terms of the property, this is really specific to every organization. You have to understand the real estate. You have to understand the real estate in a way that you've never really probably worried about. Maybe there's no toilet, or maybe you just flush it and don't think about, well, is there a septic system that's going to meet anyone's requirements? Are there environmental issues that we are not dealing with? And are there title issues that we really have to overcome before we have clear title to sell this property? And then the understanding the collection and the appropriate ways that museums dispose of objects is really important for every organization. If you have gift agreements with certain donors that you've accepted properties, pieces of your collections as a gift, those gift agreements have to be dusted off, and you have to look at those terms and understand what the objects are. You have to know whether objects have been given to you or if they're on loan. You have to know whether the collection is historical or is it just stuff in the house. What is the nature of this collection, and what is the appropriate way of going about disposing this. And I think unlike the real estate issues that nonprofits face, there's less guidance for how museums deal with their collected materials. There's no such thing as an easement on collected materials. So I think the way Pawtucket handled their collection was really appropriate, to go to the state's collector to say, what are the objects that are important to Rhode Island history? They were just given. They were not saying, we're going to sell you these things. They were just given. And then to deal responsibly with the rest of the materials is a decision. But it starts from understanding what your legal responsibilities are to the collection and what the collection itself does. And so my last thing to think about is a public relations plan to get you from the beginning of this process to the end. What we did with Pawtucket, who really said nobody's going to notice or care. Nobody comes when we do a program, so why would anyone notice and care? And I said, oh, you have no idea how many people will notice and care. So we prepared a plan, an internal plan, and I think you attached the FAQs, the frequently asked questions, Barbara, to the thing. So we asked ourselves to imagine all of the most difficult questions, and then we listened to the answers, and then we imagined having those difficult questions pasted on the front page of the local newspaper. And listened to the questions. And then we imagined who was answering those questions, and what the answer was, what the tone was, how defensive it sounded, how forthright it sounded, and really began to think what are we going to say so that everyone on the board was going to be on the same page, but also who cares people. Because as we all know, not everybody should be talking about this because they're not as fully informed, or they're just not as easy with the public relations as it is. I think it's important that the organizations that you take your time to tell your story. The public's understanding of house museums is really low. They don't understand the finances. They don't really understand how they came to be set up or what they're doing. And taking time to tell the story about the place about the financial realities of your business. There's nothing like that to sort of say, oh, I didn't understand, and then it really does help. And then, as Barbara said, assuring people that the property is not leaving town is really important. You know, it doesn't even occur to us that are so concerned with the history of this place, but that other people also want to have that reassurance that the place will be protected, and so that you work through that model. So those are my sort of quick practicalities. I think you can tell this is a thing. It takes leadership, it takes time, it takes a process to work through snags, it takes consultations with experts and stakeholders. It can be long, it can be sometimes a difficult process, but it might just be the most important work that you do to save your place for the future. So getting that building into the hands of the next steward who has the resources to take care of the place may really be the most wonderful gift you can give to your historic place. It is such a delight to visit the Joseph Spaulding House. We've been on a couple of visits to look at projects that the new owners are undertaking, and they are being very typical homeowners where they overspend on their wonderful place because they love it so much. And you know, it's just a delight to see that kind of investment in a place that could not thrive in its museum ownership. There's just great energy. So that's our presentation, and we have questions going. We're ready to open the floor for anybody. Questions, compliments, criticisms, whatever you want to do.
So for this period, you guys can actually either type in the chat feature or actually unmute yourself and actually speak. There was a comment earlier that came in about more long-term rentals versus selling. I know, Barbara, you mentioned that you guys did kind of do the Airbnb thing. I do, like Newport Restoration Foundation does the long-term rentals, and I know a bunch of other organizations that do more long-term. Did you guys think about long-term, or do you just want it out?
We thought about long-term. We thought about, well, what if we just rent the house to a person who wanted to live there for the long term, but still it would keep us, we would still be property owners, and that just wasn't part of the mission of the organization. And, you know, we just didn't see it, you know, that the organization could thrive and also, you know, have to maintain a property, even if a renter, you know, would want to take care of it and do sort of low maintenance, but it would still be our responsibility. There was once during a storm, there was a big tree in front of the house that fell onto the house across the street, and that's the kind of thing that we just didn't want to have to deal with. So we talked about it, but we also didn't see it as the best solution for the long term.
Gail actually has the question here. She raised her hand. She's actually the one that asked the question earlier.
Yes, I was just going to follow up, Barbara, because it sounds like you didn't own any property. So I'm wondering if you know what the history was of deciding to take this property in the first place. Like, what were the expectations? What were you hoping to accomplish at the beginning?
It wasn't our choice. So the house was deeded to the Preservation Society, and without, you know, it's a complicated thing. I will say there was some cross-pollination between the two organizations, and this was before I was involved with the PSP, so I wasn't really around for the discussions. But I think because there were people that were sitting on both boards, and the PHRC was failing and going out of business, and so I think he was like, well, we'll just transfer this over to the Preservation Society. That's the most logical place for it to go. And I think, you know, because the deed, it's so complicated, and I think the average person, I didn't understand it for a long time. The average person, I think, wouldn't understand it. And so if you're sort of just sitting in a board meeting, you know, you might not understand the long-term ramifications of accepting this house. or you're optimistic and thinking that, oh yeah, what a great house, and people will be so interested in that, and they'll come to all these programs, and we can make it work. But the reality is that it just didn't happen. And I also should perhaps mention the society owned another house prior to this. So this was the second property that we owned. We owned a sort of an office. It was another 1828 house, coincidentally, but it was where our office was, and we were renting out portions of that building. So we sold that in 2000. Early 2000s, middle of 2016, I think it was. So it was, at the time when the Spaulding House was deeded to the society, hopes were high, and people were thinking that, the rental income from the other building would perhaps fund, the Spaulding House and so forth. But it just, as time went on, we could see that, resources were just going down the drain, and it wasn't logical for us to keep it.
I think I was sort of on the fringes of that discussion as well. And I think there was a sort of a willful blindness to the financial realities, that there were advocates for keeping the place. There were people who really had a lot of affection for Betty and her vision for the property. And there was a little bit of money. What was the endowment, $40,000 or something, which
yeah.
I think it allowed people to blind themselves to the real finances that they were taking on. And that happens to boards all the time. Is if you don't have the right people asking the right questions at the boards, you get into making decisions that really aren't good business decisions.
Right. Yeah. There was a lot of emotion tied up in the process. I never knew Betty, so for me, it was good in a way that I could sort of move forward, a little bit more objectively, and not have that sort of, the emotion of knowing Betty as a person. But, several years before that, the leadership and members of the board, they knew her very well. And, the phrase Betty's dream, Betty's dream, Betty's dream kept coming up. And so there was this sense of, well, if we sell this house, we're dishonoring Betty's dream in some way. And so, we had to get over that, frankly, and be more practical. And as Val was talking about, we really had to think not only of our personal connections and, other people, friendships with Betty or whatever. We had to really just think about the organization. It was an organization we were serving and not ourselves.
Ken Trino has his hand raised. Physically.
Right, I know. No, I had to do the other one. I just want to thank Valerie and Barbara, because this was so clearly put together, and you just did an amazing job, I think. And I actually lived through this process. I'm not sure if Valerie knows about that. Our process took 10 years. I was on a board for a historic house in New Hampshire that was left in a will to be set up as a historic house museum. I'm not going to go into the whole detail. It parallels this tremendously, and I compliment you on doing it in less than 10 years. I will just say one thing, in that we had to deal with the fact that the donor had left all the money for the house to her 10 cats. And when the 10 cats died, we got the money to help the museum, which the museum had no heat, no running water, no electricity. So ours was a little more complicated, but I thought this was so clear. I urge you to write this up for NEMA, for other people to see. One, and no, someone asked what happened to the cats. We actually, when we got just looked in the chat, we had to go to the Attorney General, and you don't break the will, amend the will, so that we could then essentially, we looked at it at de-accessioning. It wasn't even a house museum. And we bought cat condos. By that time, we were down to 3 cats, and we found a place that would take the cats for $25,000 for life tenancy. And that was part of our process. It's written up in ASLH. So no, we did not get the cats, Tim. But these things are complicated. And like you, we had a beloved high school teacher, beloved by everyone on town on the board. And he knew Ms. Rollins, the donor, and he was just fighting when there were no more battles to, do what she wanted, turn this into a historic house museum. And there was just no way it was going to happen. So it went in actually the Historic New England's easement program.
Oh, good.
But thank you. This was a great case study.
Great, thank you. Are we looking in the chat or?
No, if you guys do have any follow-up questions, I know it's always one of those things, if you're left in the will, what do you do with it type situation. But Ken, I think you do take the star on that one for the cats.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah. Yeah, and again, I'll repeat, I mean, it actually, Betty did not, that was one thing people were saying from the community. Oh, well, you're doing the wrong thing because Betty left you her house. Well, no, Betty didn't leave us her house. In fact, she specifically said we should not have her house. So her will was changed in probate, and that's something the community would not know. So we get the criticism for making the decision to sell her house, but it wasn't something she wanted to have happen to begin with. So
I know with any type of deaccessioning, because I've watched it in New England and beyond, any type of deaccessioning, there's definitely some very strong emotions associated with it, associated with the pieces, just right, wrong, that type of situation. So yeah, it's not an easy thing to undertake, but it's definitely something that has to happen eventually for some places. So. Does anybody have any additional questions for Barbara and Valerie, since we do have them on the line and they are more than willing to answer anything?
I have a question to the audience. Is there anyone who's sort of at the beginning of this stage, or is this just idle ways to spend your pandemic time? Are you struggling with any particular part of the process? Because we could be Badinskis.
Well, I mean, speaking for me, I mean, I certainly, am happy to, if anybody after this has questions or just want to recap or, I mean, I'll obviously anytime share. I can't necessarily give advice or suggestions, but I can share, along the way what we did. Because this is a first experience for me, and I don't expect I'll ever do it again. So yeah, I mean, one thing I'll add is, ironically, I said I never knew Betty, and I shared this with Val and others that, before we actually were able to come to the decision, the final decision that yes, we were going to sell the house, I knew that, the house packed full of stuff, and I mean packed. And what I didn't want to have happen is, all of a sudden we're getting ready to sell the house. The house is listed and the realtor says you have to empty it out. And, how could we possibly do that? So, at least a year in advance, I was spending time there, spending like 2 hours a week, just throwing out stuff that was obviously trash. And, so in the year that I spent, in the house with my hands on all of her stuff, I actually felt like I did come to know Betty in the end, because I handled practically every single thing that was there. So while it was, a clear decision for me, and for our board to sell the house, in the end, I felt like, I kind of did know her, and there ended up being a little bit of, not conflict, but sort of an emotional, I did have this emotional response when we signed at the closing. I think I got a little teary-eyed about it, like this thing is finally leaving, so.
Gail had another question.
Yeah, so I do a lot of work with boards, and Val and Barbara, just in hindsight and in foresight, thinking about how this may have changed or influenced your thinking about board composition for, you know, the all-volunteer historical society or museum or preservation society. Like, who do you need and who do you want and what would you have changed? And just any insight that you have around that would be helpful.
Well, I think that some of, at least from the Rhode Island experience, some of these nonprofits that own historic sites are the very lowest capacity organizations you can imagine. They don't pay much attention to their board composition, recruiting new members. They have a lot of difficulty recruiting new members. And what I see is boards that are cycling without much self-awareness that they're cycling down into real dysfunction. And I just can't even imagine how to do that. I used to live in Hingham, Massachusetts, and there was a nonprofit that managed a cemetery there, and which is a common way of managing cemetery land. And the board of that nonprofit kind of died, like literally they died. And so when the last person died, nobody knew where the key to the gate was. I mean, it's that kind of, that's my biggest fear for some of the historic sites, is that the boards will just, they're all getting older and they will just die, and who will know who will then take on the responsibilities of the property. I think it's a significant preservation threat that we have. And there's some that argue that no, it's sort of like a community club and somehow they will self-perpetuate. You don't have to worry about it. But I don't know. I feel like they're dying.
Well, I mean, we're in a position of, you know, beggars can't be choosers in a way, but we have been extremely lucky that, first of all, I mean, through the process, I mean, several of the board members, you know, had their terms end, and everybody volunteered, you know, to just stay, you know, for the process. Nobody was abandoning ship. You know, for which I personally am extremely grateful. And we've added, you know, several new board members since the process. And what we're, I think, really, we've just been lucky that we've had really interesting and people with, you know, sort of creative ideas and a vibrant energy, you know, just to be open-minded about new kinds of programming, creative ways to go about preservation work instead of, you know, sort of the, I don't know, the old way of doing things. You know, preservation has to be, you know, this and in a box. And so we've been, you know, we're just doing our thing as best as we can. And we've been very lucky that a few people, you know, have wanted to join us in doing that. And our board members are actually, generally a bit younger than they were two years ago. So that, you know, is nice also.
There you go.
I do have a garbage can behind me, so I'm apologizing for that one. If you guys do have any follow-up questions, definitely this is the time, or we could cut out a little early. Barbara and Valerie will definitely, if you guys do want to email them and stuff, that would be great. David has to go off to a class. And then I will be sharing the link for the recording, and then also just a follow-up link for an evaluation, and also the link to all the great resources that Barbara and Valerie did provide earlier. So you guys do have all of that information. Valerie, Barbara, any follow-up questions or ending?
I just appreciated everyone's time and attention, because it's fun to reflect on this process, and I don't know, it feels like a really good thing that we did for the Joseph Spaulding House in Pawtucket.
Hey, Elliot.
Yeah.
Good. Good timing. Just finished.
Yeah, thank you all for participating. This is really interesting for me too.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody. We'll see you at another NEMA event.
Thank you.